I remember the smell first. That's what they don't tell you when they pull you from the Schola Progenium with marks high enough to warrant special consideration. They don't mention the smell. Incense. Yes, everyone knows about the incense, the sacred oils, the parchment smoke from burning confessions. But underneath, beneath the frankincense and myrrh, there's another smell entirely. Copper and excrement. Fear sweat, with its particular acidic tang. The sweetish note of early-stage necrosis. And something else, something I could never quite name, that I came to understand was the smell of truth being extracted from human meat. My name was Sebastian Call, no relation to the Archmagos, a fact I had to clarify with tedious regularity during my early years in service. I was 17 when the Ordos Hereticus representative appeared at my schola, a tall woman in black who smelled of lavender despite everything, who looked at my record of theological disputation and investigative philosophy and saw potential. I thought I saw my future then, bright and terrible and glorious. I thought I understood what service to the Emperor truly meant. I understood nothing. The induction facility occupied 17 sublevels beneath a Ministorum cathedral on a world I'm no longer permitted to name, assuming I could remember it accurately anyway. The upper levels were Baroque grandeur vaulted ceilings encrusted with gold leaf, stained glass windows filtering light into scattered jewels of color, cherubim carved from pale stone frozen in eternal adoration. The deeper you descended, the more that grandeur peeled away like dead skin. By the 10th level, the walls were bare rockcrete, damp and cold. By the 15th, they were raw stone, weeping moisture that formed calcified streams like frozen tears. The 17th level was where they taught us the fundamentals. My instructor was a man named Interrogator Prefect Goolan, though he insisted we call him nothing but Prefect, in a voice like gravel sliding down a drainpipe. He'd lost his left eye to a heretic's lascutta during an interrogation that had gone sideways, and the augmetic replacement that whirred in the socket was a crude, industrial thing that glowed a faint amber in the dark. He was 63 when I met him, though he looked 80, and he would be dead within 2 years, killed by a confession, but that comes later. The Emperor, he told us on our first day, arranging 6 novice interrogators in a semicircle before a restraint chair bolted to the floor, demands truth. Not truth as philosophy, not truth as theological construction, truth as material reality, extracted and quantified and documented with such precision that no appeal, no mercy, no reconsideration is possible. Do you understand? We nodded. 6 of us, fresh from various scholar institutions across the sector, selected for aptitude and temperament. Maris, a girl from a shrine world with eyes like chips of obsidian. Tolvan, stocky and methodical, who approached problems like mathematical proofs. Jacinda, whose family had served the Ordos for 3 generations. Petrock and Highland, twins who could have been carved from the same block of pale granite. And myself. You don't understand, Goolan said flatly. Not yet. You think you do, but understanding comes from doing. Theory is ash. Practice is iron. He gestured to the chair with one gnarled hand. Who wants to volunteer? I raised my hand before I could think better of it. That was always my weakness, enthusiasm, eagerness, the desire to prove myself worthy of the honor that had been bestowed upon me. Goolan's amber eye whirred as it focused on my face, and something that might have been amusement or pity or contempt flickered across his scarred features. Sit, he said. The restraint chair was cold even through my robes. The metal bands closed around my wrists and ankles with pneumatic hisses, tight enough to immobilize without cutting circulation. A collar engaged around my throat, not choking but present, a constant reminder of vulnerability. The other novices watched with carefully neutral expressions as Goolan circled me slowly, his boots scraping against the stone floor. Interrogation, he said, his voice taking on a lecturing quality, begins with control. Physical control, yes, but more importantly, psychological control. The subject must understand, completely and without reservation, that their body is no longer their own, that their voice, their breath, their very thoughts, exist now only at our sufferance. He stopped in front of me. Call. Tell me something true. I serve the Emperor. I said immediately. His hand moved faster than I could track, not striking me, but gripping my jaw with fingers strong as steel cables, forcing my head back until I was staring at the rock ceiling 20 feet above, at the moisture stains that looked almost like faces in the flickering lumen light. Something true, he repeated softly. Not something rote, not a catechism. Truth. My throat clicked as I swallowed. His fingers dug into the hinges of my jaw, and I could feel my pulse hammering against his palm. The smell of the room seemed to intensify that copper and rot smell, seeping up from the very stones. "I'm frightened," I whispered. He released me immediately, stepping back. "Good. Fear is honest. Fear is the bedrock upon which all confession is built. Remember that both as interrogator and as human, we are not Astartes, armored against feeling. We are not servitors, programmed beyond emotion. We are human, and we work with human materials, and fear is the universal currency." He reached for something on a nearby equipment rack, a simple iron rod, perhaps 18 inches long, unremarkable except for the way the metal seemed to drink the light. "Pain is a tool," he said, running his thumb along its length. "Not the only tool, often not even the best tool, but a tool that must be mastered. Call, I'm going to strike you now. 3 times. Your task is to remain silent." I wanted to protest, to argue that this wasn't what I'd signed up for, that I was there to interrogate enemies of the Imperium, not to be beaten by my instructor in some barbaric initiation rite. But Golan's amber eye whirred and focused, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was the lesson. Not the mechanics of interrogation, not the catalogue of techniques we would learn in the months to come, but this, the understanding of what it meant to be subjected to the will of another. The first blow caught me across the thigh, and the pain was extraordinary. Not the sharp, bright pain of a lace wound or the dull throb of bruising, but something that seemed to resonate through my entire leg, traveling up the nerve pathways like fire through dry timber. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood, felt the copper warmth flood my mouth, but I didn't cry out. The second struck my ribs, lower left, and I heard something crack, not breaking, not quite, but something shifting, something warning me that I existed at the very edge of serious injury. My breath hitched, and I felt my vision starting to grey at the edges. The third never came. "Well done," Goolan said, setting the rod aside. He touched a release stud, and the restraints opened with hisses of escaping air. "You pass. For now." For now. I climbed out of the chair on shaking legs, my ribs screaming with every breath, my thigh already swelling beneath my robe. Maris was staring at me with something between horror and respect. Tolvan had gone pale. The twins wore identical expressions of grim determination. "The lesson," Goolan continued, addressing all of us now, "is not pain for pain's sake. The lesson is this: you must know, intimately and completely, what you are doing to others. You must understand it not as theory but as lived experience. Only then can you calibrate correctly. Only then can you judge what is necessary versus what is excess. Only then can you approach this work with the proper respect." He pulled up his right sleeve, exposing a forearm crisscrossed with dozens of scars, burns, cuts, punctures, the distinctive circular marks of shock prods. "Every technique you will learn to apply, you will first learn to endure. This is not cruelty. This is professionalism. An interrogator who does not understand suffering cannot extract truth. They can only extract noise." Over the next 6 months, we learned to endure water, hot and cold, electricity in carefully measured doses, pressure points and stress positions, sleep deprivation in soundproof cells where time became meaningless, sensory overload in rooms where light and sound became physical forces that battered the psyche, pharmaceutical compounds that twisted perception, that made minutes feel like hours, that dissolved the boundaries between self and space. We learned the theory too, the 17 categories of heresy, the psychological profiles of different apostate types, the genuinely deluded, the maliciously corrupted, the simply criminal who wrapped their greed in pseudo-theological justification, the legal frameworks that governed confession extraction, the elaborate documentation requirements, the chains of authorization that stretched from our damp stone cells up through the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Ordos, and ultimately to the God Emperor himself, watching from his golden throne. But theory was ash, as Goolan said. Practice was iron. My first real interrogation came on a winter morning when the moisture on the cell walls had frozen into delicate crystal patterns that caught the lumen light like captured stars. The subject was a merchant suspected of trading with Xenos specifically, of purchasing archaeotech artifacts from an Eldar corsair vessel and reselling them on the black market. Not a heretic, technically. Not a cultist. Just a man who had put profit above the Emperor's law and now had to explain himself. His name was Harvin something or other, I don't remember his family name, which is itself significant. Hundreds of names have passed through my consciousness in the years since, and most have evaporated like morning fog, leaving behind only impressions, types, categories. Harvin was perhaps 40, running to fat, with the soft hands of someone who'd never done manual labor, and the distinctive grey pallor of someone who spent most of their life in the eternal twilight of a hive city's mid-levels. Goolan supervised, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, his amber eye whirring softly as it tracked my movements. I'd prepared according to protocol, reviewed the case file, identified the key questions, planned an interrogation strategy that emphasized psychological pressure over physical coercion. Harvin's type, I'd assessed, would respond better to existential dread than to pain, to the slow, grinding realization of his situation rather than sudden shocks. "Harvin," I said, seating myself across from where he sat, chained to the interrogation chair. I kept my voice calm, almost conversational. "Do you understand why you're here?" He nodded frantically. "A misunderstanding, honored interrogator. A terrible misunderstanding. I would never—" "Stop." I held up one hand. "I haven't asked you to explain. I've asked if you understand why you're here. These are different questions." He blinked, confusion replacing panic momentarily. In the corner, Goolan made a soft sound approval, I thought. This was correct procedure. Establish control immediately. Make the subject understand that even their words, their very capacity to speak, existed only with my permission. Yes, I understand. The charges. But they're false. I swear by the Emperor himself. How many times have you purchased Xenos artifacts? Never. I mean, that is, how many times? It wasn't Xenos artifacts, honored interrogator. It was simply old technology, ancient human. I let the silence extend. This was another lesson from those 6 months of training, that silence could be as effective as any shock prod, that humans were compelled by their nature to fill empty space with words, with explanation, with a desperate attempt to justify themselves. Harvin held out for perhaps 30 seconds before the words started spilling out of him in a desperate cascade. 3 times. Only 3 times. And I didn't know. Not at first. The man who sold them to me said they were recovered from an old colonial vessel, pre-imperial, and how was I supposed to know the difference? I'm just a merchant. I deal in curiosities. And yes, the profit was good, but that's not a crime, is it? To make profit serving the Imperium's economy. Describe them, I said. The artifacts. Detail. He did. Crystal matrices that hummed with internal harmonics. A device that projected hololithic images without any visible power source. A blade, he said. It was a blade that seemed to exist at slightly different angles depending on how you looked at it. With every description, his guilt became more evident. These weren't ancient human artifacts. These were Xenos tech, almost certainly Eldar given the aesthetic he described, and possessing such items was heresy of a particularly dangerous sort. Not for what they were, necessarily, but for what they implied: contact with the alien, corruption of the human sphere, the thin end of a wedge that could split a world's loyalty. "Where are the items now?" I asked. "Sold. All sold. Weeks ago. I can provide names." "You will. But first, describe the Eldar." His face went grey-white, the color of corpse flesh. "I don't. There was no Eldar. I told you, it was a human merchant." I stood slowly, walked to the equipment rack, selected a shock prod. I didn't activate it, didn't threaten him with it. simply held it loosely in my right hand as I returned to my seat. The message was clear. We were moving from conversation to something else. Harvin, I said gently, I need you to understand something. The penalty for possessing Xenos artifacts is death. The penalty for trading with Xenos is death. The penalty for lying to an Imperial interrogator is death. You are already dead, by any rational calculation. The only variable now is how much you suffer before the Emperor claims you and how many others your confession brings into the light. Do you understand? He understood. I could see it in his eyes the moment when hope died, when the last illusions of rescue or mercy or bureaucratic error evaporated. He slumped in the chair, and when he spoke again his voice was hollow, defeated. She called herself Irilith. Met her in the lower docks, Section 47 Tertius, twice. The first time was an accident, I thought. I was looking at a shipment of off-world textiles and she was just there, like she'd always been there. Tall. Too tall. And her eyes. He shuddered. She knew my name. Knew my inventory. Offered the artifacts at prices I couldn't refuse. I knew it was wrong, but the profit. Emperor, forgive me. The profit was so clean, so perfect. In the corner, Goolan nodded fractionally. This was good work. The subject was confessing, providing actionable intelligence, condemning himself with every word. I should have felt satisfaction, professional pride in a job well done. Instead, I felt sick. It wasn't the confession itself that disturbed me. It was the look in Harvin's eyes, the absolute despair, the knowledge that he had been weighed and measured and found wanting, that his life was forfeit, and nothing he could do or say would alter that fundamental reality. He was, in that moment, already dead. His body simply hadn't stopped moving yet. The interrogation continued for another 3 hours. I extracted names, locations, dates, the complete network of Harvin's heretical trade. Goolan asked clarifying questions occasionally, his gravel voice cutting through Harvin's increasingly desperate rambling. By the end, we had enough information to justify 14 additional arrests and the purging of an entire dockside district. Harvin was executed 2 days later. I didn't attend. Junior interrogators weren't required to witness the culmination of their work, though some did anyway, some combination of morbid curiosity and professional thoroughness. I told myself I was busy with documentation, with the endless after-action reports and evidence chains that were the sinew and bone of the Ordo's work. The truth, which I didn't admit even to myself for months afterward, was that I couldn't bear to watch him die. This man I'd broken, whose destruction I'd facilitated with such precise professionalism. The disconnect between the work and its consequences hadn't fully registered until that moment. Goolan found me in the archives that evening, sorting through confession transcripts from previous cases, trying to lose myself in the abstract patterns of heresy and investigation. He sat down across from me without invitation, producing a bottle of Amasec from somewhere in his robes and 2 small glasses. "Drink," he said, pouring. I drank. The liquor burned, harsh and medicinal. "You did well today," he continued. "Clean extraction, minimal coercion, full confession with supporting intelligence. Exemplary work for a first solo interrogation. Thank you, Prefect. And you feel terrible about it?" It wasn't a question. I stared at my glass, at the way the amber liquid caught the lamplight. "That's normal," Goolan said. "Expected even. We're not monsters, Cole, whatever the rest of the Imperium might think. We're human, and we're required to do inhuman things in the Emperor's service. The trick, the only trick that matters, is learning to carry it without letting it destroy you." "How?" I asked. "How do you carry it?" His amber eye whirred, focusing and refocusing on my face. "You remember that every person in that chair is a threat to humanity's survival. Every heretic unconfessed is a door left open for the enemy. Every cultist who goes undiscovered is a canker spreading through the body of the Imperium. The work is ugly. The work is brutal. But the work is necessary, and someone must do it, and we are the ones who've been chosen. Does that help?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It won't," he said flatly. "Not really. But you'll keep doing it anyway, because you're good at it, and because the alternative is unthinkable. He poured himself another drink. The first one is always hardest. It gets easier. He was wrong about that, I would learn. It didn't get easier. It got familiar, which is not the same thing at all. I conducted 17 interrogations over the next 9 months before my formal graduation from novice status to full interrogator. Cultists mostly, followers of the ruinous powers who had to be broken down and mapped. Their networks of corruption traced and documented and destroyed. A rogue preacher who'd been teaching doctrinal deviations in the lower hive, subtle alterations to the imperial creed that wouldn't be recognized as heresy for generations, but would metastasize into full apostasy given time. An administratum functionary who'd been cooking the books, skimming tithes not for personal gain, but to fund a network of underground shelters where he hid citizens designated for servitor conversion heresy of compassion, which was still heresy. Each interrogation was different. Each required different techniques, different approaches. The cultist who responded to pain but not to reason. The preacher who was eager to martyrdom and had to be kept alive and talking, despite his best efforts to die gloriously. The functionary who was so buried in guilt and self-justification that extracting coherent testimony was like trying to grab smoke. I learned the rhythm of the work. The preparation, reviewing files in the quiet hours before dawn. The confrontation itself. That moment when the cell door opened and I stepped across the threshold into the charged space of accusation and denial. The extraction, pulling truth from resistance like splinters from infected flesh. The documentation, endless reams of testimony and analysis and legal justification. The moment when the subject was removed to execution, to the penal legions, to whatever fate the Ordos had decreed, and I was left alone in the empty cell, smelling their fear, sweat and blood and desperation soaked into the stones. It didn't get easier, but it became normal. That was worse, I think. The moment when I realized I could eat breakfast, conduct an interrogation involving significant physical coercion, break for lunch, document the confession, and proceed with my evening without any particular emotional disruption. The work had become routine. I had become efficient. Goolan died during my 18th month of service. An interrogation gone catastrophically wrong, a chaos cultist who'd smuggled a poison needle into the cell by means we never quite determined, who'd managed to scratch Goolan during a struggle, who'd pumped him full of something that turned his blood to acid and dissolved him from the inside over the course of 3 agonizing hours. We couldn't even administer the Emperor's mercy. The toxin had targeted his nervous system in ways that made any accelerated death impossible without causing suffering exponentially worse than the slow dissolution. I sat with him in the Medicae bay while he liquefied. He couldn't speak by the end, his throat had collapsed into chemical sludge, but his amber eye continued to whir and focus, tracking my face with what I wanted to believe was recognition. When he finally stopped, there wasn't much left that resembled a human body. The Medicae staff incinerated the remains immediately, not wanting to risk contamination. Interrogator Magistrate Kevin replaced him as my supervisor. She was younger than Goolan, perhaps 45, with a sharp face and sharper mind, and a reputation for pursuing heretics with the focused intensity of a laser cutter. Under her direction, my caseload increased. 5 interrogations a week, sometimes 6, an endless procession of traitors and apostates, and Xenos lovers, and witch-touched wretches who had to be opened up and examined and catalogued. The smell never left my clothes, no matter how often I washed them. That copper rot smell, that distillation of fear and pain and bodily fluids. It seeped into the fabric, into my skin, until I couldn't tell whether I actually smelled it, or whether I'd simply become permanently sensitized to its presence. My quarters in the interrogator's dormitory reeked of it. My hair held it. When I breathed deeply, I tasted it at the back of my throat. I was promoted to interrogator secundus after 3 years. The ceremony was brief, formal, conducted in a chapel on the 3rd sublevel where stained glass windows depicted the Emperor's judgment upon the unfaithful. Kevin presented me with the signet ring that marked my new rank, silver stamped with the equals of the Inquisition, set with a small ruby that caught the filtered light like a drop of blood. I swore the oaths, the same oaths I'd sworn when I entered service, but somehow heavier now, weighted with experience and understanding. "You've proven yourself competent," Kevin told me afterward, in her office that overlooked the cathedral's nave. "More than competent. Exceptional, really. Your confession rates are among the highest in the facility, your documentation is meticulous, and you've shown excellent judgment in distinguishing between genuine heresy and mere administrative deviance." "Thank you, Magistrate. I have a new assignment for you," she continued, sliding a data slate across her desk. "Priority level Vermilion. A cell of Genestealer cultists has been identified in the upper hive. 17 members, possibly more. They need to be interrogated, broken, their infection mapped and purged." I took the slate, scanning the preliminary intelligence. Genestealer cults were particularly challenging. The Xenos infection created fanatical loyalty, rewired the subject's neurology in ways that made conventional interrogation techniques less effective. Breaking them required a combination of pharmaceutical intervention, psychic analysis, and sustained physical coercion. "Timeline?" I asked. "Fast. The Ordo Xenos wants the network mapped within 4 weeks. After that, they're deploying an extermination team." Kevin's expression was neutral, professional. "The subjects won't survive the interrogations, obviously. Genestealer infection is terminal, but we need the intelligence before they're purged." Ride. 4 weeks. 17 subjects. That meant 4 interrogations per week. Minimum, with no time for the careful pacing I preferred. This would be brutal, accelerated, the kind of work that left marks on both subject and interrogator. "Understood," I said. The first of the cultists arrived that evening. His name was recorded as Matthias Vaughn, Hab worker, 3rd generation. The infection was visible in the slight elongation of his skull, the way his eyes sat, just slightly too far apart, the purple tint beneath his skin. He was chained to the interrogation chair when I entered, struggling against the restraints with a strength that was already superhuman, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth filed to points. "Pure blood filth," he hissed as I approached. His voice had an odd resonance, as if multiple voices were speaking in imperfect harmony. "The Star Children will consume you. The Patriarch sees all. Your Emperor is a corpse, and his realm is meat for the harvest." I'd heard worse blasphemy. I activated the recording equipment, spoke the date and time and case number into the Vox Recorder, then turned my attention to Matthias. "How many generations?" I asked. "Generations eternal. Generations unto the stars." I nodded to the attending Medicae servitor, and it injected Matthias with the first dose of chemical compounds, neural suppressants to reduce the Xenos influence, pain sensitizers to make coercion more effective, clarity agents to keep him conscious despite trauma. His pupils dilated, contracted, dilated again. The purple tint beneath his skin seemed to pulse. "How many generations?" I repeated. What followed was 4 hours of systematic interrogation. I used electricity first, measured doses through contact points at his major nerve clusters, then water, the near drowning that floods the brain with panic chemicals, then pressure, stress positions that made his Xenos-altered joints scream. Between each application, I returned to the same questions, building a map of his cult cell through repetition and persistence. By the end, he'd given me names, locations, the signs and signals by which cult members recognized each other. He'd described the Patriarch, the 4th-generation horror that nested in the depths of the Hab complex, breeding new members and directing the cult's activities. He'd confessed to murders, to genetic seeding, to the slow, patient work of infiltrating the Hab's administrative structure. He died before I could extract everything. The combination of torture and pharmaceutical intervention pushed his already stressed physiology too far, and something in his chest simply burst, not his heart, not his lungs, but some Xenos organ that had no human name, flooding his thoracic cavity with toxic fluids. The Medicae servitor tried to stabilize him, but the process was irreversible. He drowned in his own alien blood, still cursing me with his last breath. I documented his death, filed the partial confession, moved on to the next subject. 16 remaining, 26 days remaining. The work became mechanical. Each cultist was different in the details, different levels of infection, different psychological breaking points, different physiological tolerances, but the process was essentially identical. restrain, question, apply coercion, extract, document, dispose. The days blurred together into a continuous cycle of cells and confessions and death. I stopped sleeping well. When I did sleep, I dreamed of the interrogation chamber, of endless faces in the chair, their features shifting and melting as the Xeno's taint transformed them. I dreamed of Goolan dissolving, of Harvin's despair, of Matthias drowning in purple blood. I would wake in the darkness of my quarters, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled like the interrogation cells, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or who I was or whether I was interrogator or subject. By the end of the 3rd week, I'd processed 14 cultists. 3 more remained, and I was ahead of schedule. Kevin commended me on my efficiency, noting that the intelligence I'd extracted had allowed the Ordo Xenos to identify and quarantine 17 additional infected individuals who hadn't yet begun showing physical signs. The 15th cultist was a woman named Serafina Trove. She was 2nd generation, barely infected, with only the faintest purple tint beneath her skin and a slight wideness to her eyes. She could have passed for baseline human easily, which made her more dangerous. She'd been the cult's primary infiltrator, working in the Hab Complex's administration, subtly altering records and diverting resources. "I know what you want," she said when I entered the cell. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. "I'll tell you everything. I don't want to suffer." This was unusual. Most cultists held out, their Xenos' corrupted psychology making them resistant to fear and pain. Serafina's early capitulation suggested either a weak infection or exceptional intelligence. "Why?" I asked. "Because the Patriarch is dead," she said simply. "Your Ordo Xenos killed it 2 days ago, along with the primary nest. We felt it die, all of us felt it. The connection, the purpose, the certainty, all gone. I'm not protecting anything now. I'm just—" She paused, and for a moment I saw something like grief cross her face. "I'm just waiting to die." I should have been pleased. A cooperative subject meant faster extraction, better intelligence, less physical coercion required. But something in Serafina's expression disturbed me, the hollowness, the sense of absolute loss. She'd been part of something terrible and alien and heretical, but something that had given her purpose and connection. Now that something was gone, and she was just a corrupted shell waiting for disposal. "Tell me about the secondary cells," I said. She did. For 6 hours, she described the cult's structure with meticulous detail, every member, every safe house, every contingency plan. She spoke without emotion, without resistance, a recording device rendering data. By the time we finished, I had enough intelligence to ensure the complete purging of Genestealer taint from the Hab complex. "What happens to me now?" she asked, as the guards prepared to remove her. "Execution," I said. There was no point in lying. "Quick, clean, the Emperor's mercy." She nodded slowly. "Thank you for not making it worse than it had to be." After she was removed, I sat alone in the interrogation chamber for a long time, staring at the empty chair. The smell of the room, that copper rot smell that had become my constant companion, seemed especially strong. My hands were shaking, though whether from fatigue or something else I couldn't quite determine. I realized, in that moment, that I'd been doing this work for nearly 4 years. 4 years of cells and chairs and confessions. 4 years of extracting truth from human flesh, of documenting heresy, of facilitating the Emperor's justice. I'd become good at it, efficient at it, mechanical in my precision, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anything about it at all. The last 2 cultists were processed over the following 3 days. Both died under interrogation, their Xenos physiologies failing under chemical stress. I documented their deaths, filed the final reports, presented my comprehensive intelligence package to Kevin. "Excellent work," she said, reviewing my documentation. "Ahead of schedule, complete network mapping, 0 breaches of protocol. This is exactly the quality the Ordos expects from their interrogators. Thank you, Magistrate. I'm recommending you for deployment to an Inquisitor's personal retinue," she continued. "You've demonstrated the technical skill and emotional stability required for field work." How would you feel about leaving the facility? I should have been honored. Field assignment was prestigious, visible, the kind of posting that could define a career. But sitting in Kevin's office, the stained glass filtering colored light across her desk, I felt only a vast numbness. I'll serve wherever I'm needed, I said. The deployment orders came through 6 weeks later. I was assigned to Inquisitor Drusilla Morn of the Ordo Hereticus, an experienced investigator who specialized in cult infiltration and witch hunting across a cluster of hive worlds. I packed my few belongings, my robes, my ring, my personal interrogation tools, the data slate containing copies of all my previous confessions, and prepared for transport. The night before I left, I returned to the 17th sublevel one last time. The interrogation chamber where I'd conducted my first solo work with Harvin the merchant was empty, dark, except for the emergency lumens. The restraint chair sat in the center of the room like a metal throne, the chains hanging loose. The smell was overwhelming, years of fear and blood and truth soaked into the stones, permanent as paint. I sat in the chair. The metal was cold even through my robes. I imagined the restraints closing, imagined myself on the receiving end of the questions I'd asked 100 times or more. What would I confess to, if pressed? What truths lived in the dark spaces of my own consciousness, waiting to be extracted? I sat there for perhaps an hour, alone in the dark, breathing in that copper rot smell, before finally standing and walking away. I didn't look back. Inquisitor Morn's ship, the Absolute Conviction, was a small, fast courier that smelled of incense and stale recycled air. Morn herself was 63, grey-haired, with eyes like iron and a face carved by decades of exposure to humanity's darkness. Her retinue consisted of 8 individuals, including myself, an interrogator who specialized in witches, 2 experienced investigators, 3 guard soldiers, and a tech priest who maintained the ship's systems and investigation equipment. "Call," she said when I reported to her sanctum on my first day aboard. "I've reviewed your record. Impressive confession rate, meticulous documentation, no disciplinary issues. But I don't care about statistics. I care about results. Can you get me the intelligence I need when I need it?" "Yes, Inquisitor. We'll see." She gestured to a chair, not a restraint chair, just an ordinary seat. I sat. I operate differently than facility interrogators. In the field, we rarely have the luxury of controlled environments or extended timelines. Sometimes you'll need to extract critical intelligence in minutes rather than hours, in a hab block or a ship's hold or the ruins of a burned-out shrine. Sometimes the subject will be wounded, or drugged, or in the middle of active combat. Can you adapt? I believe so, Inquisitor. Belief is insufficient. I need certainty. She leaned forward. You've been trained in controlled settings, following protocols, with Medicaid support and documentation requirements, and chains of authorization. All of that is useful. But in the field, you are the protocol. Your judgment is the authorization. If you hesitate, if you second-guess, if you fail to extract what I need when I need it, people die. Good people, loyal servants of the Emperor. Do you understand? I understand, Inquisitor. Over the next 6 months, I learned she was absolutely correct. Field interrogation was nothing like facility work. There was no careful preparation, no controlled environments, no time for the methodical extraction of complete confessions. There was only urgency, necessity, the desperate need for intelligence that could mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. My first field interrogation occurred on a mining world where cult activity had been reported. We'd tracked a suspected cultist to a reclamation facility on the edge of the primary settlement, a man named Corvin, who'd been observed making suspicious contacts and whose hab unit had contained hidden ritual objects. Morn wanted to know if he was part of a larger network or simply a lone deluded worshipper. We hit the facility at night, the guard soldiers securing the perimeter while I followed Morn into the structure. We found Corvin in a back room, surrounded by crude altars and scattered offerings. He ran, we pursued, and one of the soldiers shot him in the leg, not a kill shot, but enough to drop him. He was bleeding heavily when I knelt beside him in the corridor, his femoral artery partially severed, his life measurable in minutes rather than hours. There was no time for restraints, No time for pharmaceutical intervention, no time for carefully calibrated questioning. "How many?" I asked, pressing my hand against his wound, not to stop the bleeding, but to ensure he felt the pain, felt his mortality pressing down with the weight of my palm. He spat at me, blood and saliva, muttering something in a language that hurt to hear. I pressed harder, felt his blood hot and slick between my fingers. "How many?" "Dozens," he gasped. "Hundreds. You can't stop us. The Dark Prince already." I cut off his air supply with my other hand, waited until panic overtook defiance. "Where?" "Lower Habs, Section K-17. The shrine beneath thee." He died before finishing, blood loss and trauma shutting down his systems. I'd gotten enough. Section K-17. A shrine, direction for follow-up investigation. Morn had watched the entire exchange from a few feet away, her expression neutral. When I stood, my hands and robes soaked with Corvin's blood, she nodded once. "Adequate," she said. "Fast extraction, useful intelligence, no wasted time. That's what fieldwork requires." We purged Section K-17 the next day. 47 cultists, most of whom we killed in the initial assault. The few survivors I interrogated in the ruins of their shrine, working as fast as I could before Morn ordered the final cleansing. No documentation, no formal confessions, just intelligence extracted and acted upon. This became my new normal. Interrogations conducted in burning buildings, in the holds of captured ships, in the aftermath of firefights, where the smell of las fire mixed with the usual copper rot stench of my work. Subjects who were wounded, dying, desperate, terrified people who I had to break quickly and efficiently, and sometimes brutally, because there was no time for finesse. I developed a reputation in Morn's retinue. The Confessor, they called me, though never to my face. The Interrogator, who could extract truth from anyone, anywhere, under any conditions. Morn began using me more aggressively, deploying me to handle her most difficult subjects, the ones who wouldn't break under conventional questioning. I was good at it. Emperor help me, I was extraordinarily good at it. A year into my field deployment, we were investigating a series of unexplained deaths on a void station. 23 crew members over 2 months, all showing signs of psychic trauma bleeding from eyes and ears, spontaneous combustion, reality distortions in their immediate vicinity. Witch activity, almost certainly, but we couldn't identify the source. Morn's strategy was systematic elimination. We isolated every crew member with even trace psychic sensitivity, screened them through a battery of tests, conducted interrogations of anyone who showed irregularities. I processed 17 subjects in 3 days, working around the clock, surviving on stims and recaf, and the bitter determination that had become my default emotional state. The 18th subject was a boy, 12 years old, maybe 13. His name was Piter, and he'd been born on the void station, had never set foot on a planet, knew nothing but the ship's metal corridors and recycled air. The psychic screening had flagged him as a potential witch low-level sensitivity, mostly empathic reception, nothing that seemed overtly dangerous. But the deaths had accelerated since we'd begun our investigation. 3 more crew members in the last day alone. Morn was convinced we were missing something, that our witch was hiding among the sensitive population we'd isolated. "Break him," she told me, gesturing to where Piter sat restrained in what had been a cargo hold converted to a temporary interrogation chamber. "Find out what he knows." Piter was terrified. Not the defiant terror of a cultist facing judgment, not the resigned terror of someone caught in heresy, just simple, primal fear, a child who'd been ripped from his family and chained to a metal chair by armed strangers in black who spoke of witchcraft and corruption. "I haven't done anything," he whispered as I approached. His eyes were wide, unblinking, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." I believed him. Every instinct I'd developed over 5 years of interrogations told me this boy was innocent, that whatever psychic sensitivity he possessed was minimal and uncontrolled, that he was a victim of circumstance rather than a heretic requiring punishment. But Morn's orders were clear, and I'd learned, over those 5 years, to trust protocol over instinct, to subordinate personal judgment to the demands of the Ordos. Piter, I said, keeping my voice gentle, I need you to tell me about your abilities. What can you sense? What can you feel? Nothing. Just. Sometimes I know if people are sad or angry. That's all. I can't hurt anyone. I would never. I activated the shock prod, not a heavy dose, just enough to demonstrate seriousness. Piter screamed, his small body convulsing in the restraints. Don't lie to me, I said, still gentle, the contradiction between tone and action deliberate dissonance. Tell me what you can do. I'm not lying. Desperation made his voice crack. Sometimes I have dreams, bad dreams. I dream about things happening to people. And then sometimes they happen, but I don't make them happen. I just see it. Prophetic dreams. Low-level precognition. Extremely dangerous if uncontrolled, potentially catastrophic if he'd been exposed to warp influences. I pressed harder, used the techniques I'd mastered in the facility and refined in the field, pushing past Piter's terror to the information underneath. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of systematically dismantling a child's defenses, of making him so desperate to please, so desperate to stop the pain, that he'd tell me anything I wanted to hear. By the end, I'd extracted a confession that his dreams had grown worse, that he'd seen the deaths before they occurred, that something in the warp was speaking to him in languages he couldn't understand. He's the Vector, I told Morn after. Unwitting, but confirmed. His uncontrolled precognition has attracted warp attention, and something is using him as a conduit. The deaths will continue until he's contained. Can he be saved? Morn asked. I thought about Piter, small and terrified and broken, his confession extracted through systematic coercion. I thought about the slim chance that he could be sanctioned, trained, brought into controlled service to the Imperium rather than simply executed. I thought about what that life would look like, the black ships, the processing, the years of indoctrination and control that would transform him from a child into a weapon. No, I said, the contamination is too deep. Execution is recommended. Morn nodded. Make it quick. The boys suffered enough. I administered the Emperor's mercy myself, a neural spike through the base of the skull that ended Piter's life instantly and painlessly. It was a kindness, by our standards. A mercy. I told myself it was necessary. Told myself that Piter's uncontrolled abilities were genuinely dangerous, that leaving him alive risked further deaths, that the Imperium's survival demanded hard choices and harder men willing to make them. I told myself many things. None of them made me sleep better. The interrogations continued. Years blurred together, a continuous cycle of worlds and ships and investigations and confessions. I developed techniques, refined my craft, became one of the most effective interrogators in Morn's service. My reputation spread. Other inquisitors sometimes requested my temporary assignment to handle particularly difficult subjects. I was promoted to Interrogator Prime after 8 years of service. The ceremony was aboard the Absolute Conviction, Morn herself presenting me with the new signet ring that marked my rank. I swore the oaths again, the words familiar as breathing now, weighted with a decade of practical experience. You've served with distinction, Morn told me afterward, in her sanctum where she kept her private records. Your confession rate is exceptional, your judgment sound, your dedication to the Ordos beyond question. Thank you, Inquisitor. I'm recommending you for inquisitorial candidacy, she continued. The Ordos Hereticus is always seeking qualified candidates, and your record suggests you have the necessary qualities. How would you feel about carrying the inquisitorial seal? I should have been honored. This was the apex of an interrogator's career, the recognition that you possessed not just technical skill but the judgment and authority to direct investigations independently. Some part of me, the 17-year-old boy who'd left the Schola Progenium with marks high enough to warrant special consideration, would have been ecstatic, but sitting in Morn's sanctum, the familiar smell of incense failing to mask the deeper smells I carried with me always now, I felt only exhaustion. I would be honored, I said, because it was the expected response. The candidacy process took 3 years. Training, evaluation, psychological assessment, Review of my complete service record. I continued working during this period, conducting interrogations across a dozen worlds, extracting confessions from heretics and cultists and witches and traitors. The work never stopped. It couldn't stop. The enemies of the Imperium were endless, and the Ordo's appetite for truth was insatiable. I was 41 years old when I received my inquisitorial seal. The ceremony was formal, conducted in a cathedral on a shrine world I'm not permitted to name, attended by dozens of inquisitors and high-ranking Ordo's personnel. I swore the final oaths, the ones that bound me not just to service but to authority, that made me not just an agent of the Imperium, but an embodiment of its will. Inquisitor Call, Ordo Hereticus, empowered to investigate, to judge, to execute the Emperor's justice across the stars. I formed my own retinue. An interrogator I trained personally, 2 investigators I'd worked with under Morn, guard soldiers, a tech priest, all the necessary personnel for independent operations. I was assigned my own ship, a light cruiser named the Final Confession, and given authority to pursue investigations as I deemed necessary. I should have felt accomplished, proud, successful. Instead, I felt hollowed out. The interrogations continued. Now, I directed them rather than simply conducted them, but the fundamentals remained identical. Subject, restraint, question, coercion, extraction, documentation. The smell remained the same. The copper-rot stench of fear and blood and truth that permeated everything, that no amount of incense could mask. I found myself thinking about those I'd broken over the years. Not the major cases, not the cultists or witches whose heresy was obvious and whose fates were deserved, but the marginal ones, the ones like Harvin the merchant, caught in circumstances they barely understood, the ones like Seraphina Trove, hollowed out by loss of purpose, the ones like Piter, victims of biology and fate. How many of them had been necessary sacrifices? How many had been, what, convenient, expedient, bureaucratically satisfying? I told myself these questions were dangerous, that they led to the kind of doubt that undermined the Ordo's necessary work. I told myself that individual guilt or innocence mattered less than systematic security, that the Imperium's survival demanded ruthlessness. I told myself all the justifications Goolan had offered 2 decades ago, all the rationalizations I'd developed over years of service. But late at night, alone in my quarters, aboard the Final Confession, I couldn't escape the smell. That copper-rot smell, soaked into everything, permanent as guilt. I continued working. What else could I do? I'd spent my entire adult life in service to the Ordos, had developed no other skills, possessed no other identity. I was an interrogator, an inquisitor, an instrument of the Emperor's justice. To question that was to question my entire existence. So I didn't question. I worked. The interrogations continued. Years passed. I trained new interrogators, recruited them from Skole across the sector, taught them the techniques I'd mastered. I showed them how to extract truth efficiently, how to calibrate coercion, how to document confessions with legal precision. I tried to teach them what Goolan had taught me, that the work was ugly but necessary, that someone must do it, that we carried this burden so others wouldn't have to. I'm not sure I believed it anymore, but I taught it anyway. I'm 57 now. 40 years of service to the Ordos Hereticus. Thousands of interrogations conducted or supervised. Hundreds of confessions extracted. Dozens of heretical networks disrupted. Cult cells purged. Witch covens destroyed. My record is exemplary. My reputation unquestioned. I am, by every objective measure, one of the most successful interrogators in the Ordo Hereticus. I can't remember the last time I slept without dreaming of the interrogation chamber. The smell never leaves me now. I've become so accustomed to it that I barely notice it consciously, but it's always there, a background presence like tinnitus. Copper and rot and fear soaked into my skin, my hair, my lungs. Sometimes I wonder if others can smell it on me, if my presence carries with it the accumulated reek of 4 decades of extracted truth. I received a commendation last month. Distinguished service, exceptional dedication, exemplary results. There was a ceremony, brief and formal, attended by senior Ordos personnel. They praised my confession rates, my documentation standards, my training of new interrogators. They called me a pillar of the Hereticus, a model of what an Inquisitor should be. I accepted their praise with appropriate humility and gratitude. That night, I returned to my quarters aboard the final confession, and sat in the darkness, breathing in that smell, thinking about Harvin and Matthias, and Seraphina, and Peiter, and all the others whose names I can't quite remember anymore. Thinking about the boy I'd been at 17, fresh from the schola, eager to serve, convinced I understood what duty meant. I understood nothing then. I'm not sure I understand anything now. Tomorrow I have 3 interrogations scheduled. A suspected cultist, a rogue preacher, an administratum functionary accused of doctrinal deviation. Standard cases, nothing unusual. I'll conduct them with professional precision, extract the necessary confessions, document everything according to protocol. The work will continue, as it always continues, as it must continue, because someone has to do it. Someone has to sit in the darkness beneath the cathedrals, in the cells that smell like copper and rot, extracting truth from human flesh. Someone has to carry that burden, to become the instrument of the Emperor's justice, to do the ugly necessary work that keeps the Imperium functioning. I tell myself this is service, that this is duty, that this is necessary. I tell myself many things. The smell never leaves. I think, sometimes, about Goolan dying in the Medicae Bay, his body dissolving into chemical sludge, his amber eye tracking my face until the very end. I think about the lesson he tried to teach me that first day, when he put me in the interrogation chair and asked me to tell him something true. I was frightened, I'd said. That was true then. It's true now, but not for the same reasons. I'm frightened of what I've become, of the ease with which I can extract confession, the mechanical efficiency I've developed, the way the work has become routine. I'm frightened of the hollowness inside me where emotion used to live, the numbness that's replaced the sickness I felt after that first interrogation with Harvin. I'm frightened that I've done terrible things in service to necessity, and I can't tell any more where necessity ended and mere efficiency began. I'm frightened that when I die, whether by violence or age or some other fate, I won't be able to answer the question of whether my service was truly necessary or simply convenient, whether the thousands of people I've broken were genuine threats to the Imperium or just expedient. But mostly I'm frightened that I'll continue doing this work regardless, because it's what I am, because I have no other identity, because stopping would mean confronting questions I lack the courage to face. Tomorrow I have 3 interrogations scheduled. I'll conduct them with professional precision. The smell will remain, and somewhere, in a schola progenium on a world I don't know, a 17-year-old student with high marks in theological disputation and investigative philosophy will receive a visit from an Ordos representative. They'll offer that student an opportunity, a chance to serve the Emperor in special capacity, to become something more than ordinary. That student will accept, eager and idealistic, convinced they understand what service means. They'll understand nothing, but they'll learn. Emperor help them, they'll learn. The interrogations continue. They always continue. Someone must do this work, must sit in the darkness, extracting truth from human flesh, must carry the burden of the Imperium's necessary cruelties. I've done it for 40 years. I'll do it until I die. And the smell, that copper rot smell of fear and blood and truth, will remain long after I'm gone, soaked into the stones of 1,000 interrogation chambers across 1,000 worlds, permanent as prayer, eternal as the Imperium itself. This is what I've become. This is what the service made me. This is the truth I carry, the confession I can never speak aloud, the burden that weighs heavier than any chain. I am an interrogator, and the smell never leaves.